Hello, I'm Jordan, and I'm going to do a tag today. First time I've done a tag in quite a while. And this was created by AJ Dunn from AJ Dunn Reads and Writes, and I was tagged by the great Tom of Tom LA Books. And this is the Canterbury Tales book tag, appropriately coming in spring. And it is a beast of a tag. It is by far the largest tag in terms of number of prompts that I know of. There's 26 prompts here. I will try to be brief. I have a hard time talking for extended periods of time anyway, so hopefully that will work in my favor here. But I do want to do justice to the tag because it's a very good one. So the first prompt is the host is the character who relates the tales to the reader. He is large, loud, and merry. Recommend a mammoth book over 800 pages for March of the Mammoths. And I'm going to go with a book that I talked about recently on this channel, and that is Diarmaid MacCulloch's Christianity, the First 3,000 Years, which is a massive, comprehensive history of Christianity, starting with the beginning of Judaism and up to the present day. And it is just a unbelievably illuminating and fascinating book. The subject matter is, of course, fascinating on its own, at least to me. But it's also the execution is it's just great. It's just a fabulously entertaining book to read. In addition to being a fascinating topic. Two is The Knight stands for fighting, war, and bravery. Recommend a book with a courageous main character. I'm going to go with kind of a probably unusual choice here, and I'm going to go with Prince Mishkin from The Idiot by Dostoevsky. And Mishkin is kind of in the line of Dostoevsky's holy fools, which appear in quite a few of his books. I think Mishkin is my favorite of the instances, and the reason I'm concluding him in a courageous context is I do think there is something very, very admirable about his simplicity and his almost mindless devotion. It's weird. It's a very funny, absurd kind of situation that Dostoevsky really revels in, this kind of devotion and simplicity. But it's also deeply, deeply profound. And I think, I'm not an expert, but there is a sense of religious truth that comes across in Dostoevsky's description of these kinds of characters, like Prince Mishkin. And I think one of my favorite scenes in any Dostoevsky novel is in this book, and it's a scene when Prince Mishkin is walking up the stairs to his apartment, and another character in the novel, a jealous lover, leaps out at him with a knife and is about to stab him to death. And Prince Mishkin's response is, "I don't believe it," and it's just such it's so absurd and hilarious, but also very, very profound. And I do think that there is a courage in that kind of goodness, even if it is ridiculous and absurd and incongruous with the world as it's described in the novel and the world in reality, if that makes sense. So I'm going to go with Prince Mishkin. Number three is The Wife of Bath, stands for marriage, sex, and arguing. Tell us about a book with a strong female character. I'm going to go with a book I read a year or two ago called My Absolute Darling by Gabrielle Talent, which isn't a great book, but it's about a young woman, a girl, I think she's probably 13 or 14 if I remember correctly, who is living in an intensely dysfunctional and abusive environment. But she is extremely strong in every sense of the word. And it's a very interesting book. I do think it falls under the category of dude bro lit, which I think is an extremely lazy and kind of ridiculous term, the same as chick lit. But I do think that My Absolute Darling would qualify for dude bro by anyone's standards. But it is an interesting book. So if it sounds interesting, you might want to check it out. It's well written. I do think it kind of falls apart at the end, but it certainly showcases an extremely strong female character. Four is The Pardoner, is all about ambiguity. Tell us about your favorite queer character or characters. I had a bit of a hard time with this one, but I ended up going with the title character in Mrs. Dalloway, which is, of course, Mrs. Dalloway. I think calling this a queer book or Mrs. Dalloway just a queer character, reducing it to that level does not do justice to this book, which is a book of life. But certainly there is that element to Mrs. Dalloway as a character. And she is, of course, endlessly fascinating and admirable herself in a lot of ways. So I'm going to go with Mrs. Dalloway. 5 is the miller is bold, blasphemous, and overturns conventions. Who is your favorite naughty character? For this, I am going to go with, I always forget his name, Autolycus from Winter's Tale by Shakespeare. There are, of course, many, many tricksters and fools and clowns and witty kind of unconventional peripheral characters in many of Shakespeare's plays. Autolycus may be my favorite. Of course, not counting the Fool and Lear. He's just so delightful, and he has an element of good-heartedness to him. I don't think that's true, actually. I think all of his goodness is totally incidental. It's a whim. But he is a very fun character, and it's a very, very fun and very, very moving play. I don't think it gets as much attention as it should. I certainly recommend reading Winter's Tale if you haven't, by Shakespeare. 6 is the Prioress, is modest, quiet, and compassionate. Recommend a book you don't hear much about on YouTube or BookTube. I'm going to go with E.R. Edison's fantasy novel, The Worm Ouroboros, which predates Gormenghast and Lord of the Rings by quite a while. I think this came out in the 20s, I want to say. But it is a very, very kind of ornate and dense fantasy novel. It's full of purple prose and strange romantic flights of fancy. 1926. And it's really good. It's a lot of fun. I think we modern fantasy readers tend to not expect a certain level of flowery prose, which I think was a given in earlier fantasy, and I think this definitely showcases that. The same with Lord Dunsany. But this is different from Lord Dunsany in the fact that it is more focused on like sword and sorcery type things, which will become more prominent later on, as I understand it. But it's just a very fun, very immersive fantasy novel, which I don't think I've ever heard mentioned anywhere on BookTube. So if you're interested in it, in that kind of thing, definitely check it out. I loved it. Sorry, I'm losing my place here. 7 is the monk cares little for the rule of work and prayer. Tell us about an unconventional character. I'm going to go again with Virginia Woolf and go with Orlando. Orlando is the title character of the book, and he is a character that lives over the course of many centuries and at one point changes genders, and he is a very fun character in himself, and it's a very, very fun, like Mrs. Dalloway, it's so full of life, but in a very different way. It's kind of a fantasy novel. Don't know, I think I've talked about Orlando in the past, but definitely check it out. It's not what you would expect, I think, from Virginia Woolf if you've only read Mrs. Dalloway or To the Lighthouse. So certainly Orlando is an unconventional character in an unconventional book, and a very good one. I think there's a case to be made that this is her best book, at least of the ones I've read. I think I have to go with Mrs. Dalloway, but this is just so strange and charming. I've only read it once, but I do want to return to it again. It strikes me as a very good spring or summertime read. 7 is the monk cares little for the rule of... Oh, I just did that, didn't I? 8 is the friar. It's all about confession. Confess to us. Have you read the Bible, Torah, Quran, or other religious texts all the way through? I have read the Bible. I read the King James Bible last year, which of course includes the Torah. I'm also working my way through the Robert Alter translation of the entirety of the Hebrew scripture. And I am actually currently reading, in the middle of reading, the Quran. This is the Pickthall translation, and I'm very, very much enjoying this. I may make a video about it in the near future. 9 is the summoner is lecherous and a drunk who tries to sound more educated than he is. Tell us a book that sounded better than it was. I'm going to go with The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula Le Guin. I love Ursula Le Guin. I think she's probably my favorite single sci-fi writer. And I had high hopes for The Lathe of Heaven, partly because it's set in my home city, which is Portland. And Portland is very prominent as a setting in the book, and partly because the premise is so intriguing. It's a story of a man whose dream life and dreaming world affects reality. And it sounds wonderful, but I think that the execution was very, very flat and underwritten, surprisingly, from Le Guin. I expected it to be kind of have that crystal clear economical perfection that her prose has in like The Left Hand of Darkness, but it really doesn't. It's a little sloppy, and I think I attribute that to the fact that she was a huge fan of Philip K. Dick, and I think the book is very consciously trying to emulate the way Philip K. Dick wrote books, and I think that's to the book's detriment because she was a far better writer than Philip K. Dick, whether or not she knew it, and I feel like she did a disservice to herself and to the book by trying to write that way. That's just a theory of mine, but you may like it. I know it's one of her more well-liked books, but it didn't do much for me. The Parson, this is 10. The Parson is poor, but rich in thoughts and deeds. Tell us about a book that gave you more than you expected. I'm going to go with Passage to India by E.M. Forster, which for some reason I had in my head that Forster would be a very dry, stiff Edwardian writer, and maybe he is. I think that there are hints of that in this, which is the only book of his I've actually read so far. But there's also a deep spiritual dimension to this book, which I find myself thinking about a lot. I was going to read a passage from this, but it's a little long, and this is already a long tag. But suffice it to say that there is some very interesting philosophical and spiritual things going on in this book. I don't think it's perfect. I feel like the ending gets a little silly, but it was certainly more than I expected going into it, and I do look forward to returning to it and to reading more of his books in the future. 11 is The Squire stands for youth, beauty, and courting. What book did you fall in love with when you were a youth? I'm sure this is going to be a common answer. I'm going to say Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. I read that in, I think, middle school, maybe early high school, probably early high school, and of course I fell in love with the book. I don't think it holds up. I haven't read it since then, to be honest, but looking back on it, it seems a little silly. And I think it's good that it provides a lot of comfort to a lot of young people, I think, but it is just that. I think its core appeal is for very young people, and it doesn't have a whole lot to offer anyone else, in my opinion. But I think there are certainly others who would disagree with that. 12 is The Clerk says little, but his words are wise and morally virtuous. Tell us about a short book that made you a better person. This is just a little tiny book that I dip in and out of throughout my day and throughout my life that I find very useful and encouraging, and just a good little book. And it's The Teachings of the Buddha, which is just a bunch of excerpts from various sutras and also various poems from certain Buddhist sages over the ages. It's very good. 13 is The Man of Law upholds justice and knows the laws by heart. What is a book you could not imagine rereading? Geez, that's a tough one. I feel like I had an answer to this, but now I'm forgetting what it was. I did read a book last year called The Boundless Sea by David Abulafia, which was about this. It was a massive history of the world's oceans, and it was very interesting, but it was so dry in the way it was written. It was just pulverizing to read at times, even when I was interested in the subject. I was able to kind of carry myself through it just because it is a fascinating subject, but man, it's difficult for me to imagine ever returning to that in any kind of way other than just to kind of maybe consult certain passages of it. 14 is the Manciple provides the food. Recommend a series you think is good from the first book to the last. This may not come as a surprise to anyone. I'm going to go with Egypt, the series Egypt by John Crowley, which is a book about Hermeticism and esotericism and alchemy and history and mysticism. And there's 4 books in the series, and the first one is actually my least favorite, but I think it works best as a single unified book. I think it's best to read it in that sense. But yeah, it does not fade at any point. It stays strong right up to the end. And like I said, I feel like it gets better from the first book. 15. The merchant deals in furs and cloth and is powerful and wealthy. Recommend a book with a powerful message or theme. I'm going to have to pass on this one because I tend to avoid books that have a very explicit message or theme. Certainly there are books, I do like books to feel like they are, they have something kind of profound to say for sure, but if they have an explicit social message or something like that, I tend to not be very interested. And I think that's what's meant here. At least that's the way I'm interpreting it. So I'm going to pass on that one. 16. The shipman is a wine-stealing rascal. Tell us about a side character who steals the spotlight. I don't have anyone specific in mind here, but I think Dickens is a great example of books where the side characters are almost always more interesting than the core characters. I also have a theory that Dickens' most interesting characters are the ones that will not fit into his very, very simplistic and kind of boring worldview. Characters like Uriah Heep in David Copperfield, or I'm forgetting the name. There's a character in Bleak House who is kind of a poet and he's horrible with money, and Dickens kind of uses him to do his heavy-handed, didactic approach, but he's much bigger than that, and it cheapens him as a character. And he does that in many of his books. I find that generally Dickens' most interesting characters are the ones that Dickens himself doesn't seem to like. Where are we at now? 17. The physician knows what ails you and can cure it. Tell us about a book you consider a comfort read. I'm going to come back to Shakespeare with the late romances. I read all four of these quite often. That's Pericles, Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest. I find these deeply comforting and just so much fun. So again, I feel like the only one that really gets read often is The Tempest, but I do think the other three are equally good and in some cases better. So certainly read them if you haven't before. 18. The Franklin is not a vassal or a noble, but a free man. Recommend a book about freedom in any form. I'm going to go with Beloved by Toni Morrison, which obviously is about freedom, being about freed slaves. And this is a book I haven't read since high school, but man, is it beautiful, and I really, really need to return to it. This book is very, very praised on BookTube, and rightfully so. But if for some reason you haven't read it, I highly recommend reading it. It's a masterpiece. The Reeve is believable on the outside, but lies on the inside. What book was different than what the blurb led you to believe? I'm sorry, I racked my brains. I couldn't think of a single book that fits this category for me. I'm sure there have been some, but at least in recent years, I almost never read the blurbs of books. I really like to go in blind, whether it's books or movies or whatever. I find that it's a much more enjoyable experience if I don't have really any strong idea of what I'm getting into. 20. The Plowmen is good-hearted and faithful. What book do you read over and over again? The book I've probably reread most ever is a book I've talked about again quite often on this channel, and that's Mason and Dixon by Thomas Pynchon. There's just something about this book which rewards endless rereading, and is also just so immersive and fun and moving in a way that you would not expect from Thomas Pynchon. I'm not a huge fan of his work generally, but this is just a book that I find myself wanting to reread quite often. So certainly check that out as well if you haven't. 21. The Guildsmen are 5 men who act as a unit and stand for brotherhood or sisterhood. Recommend a book with a strong ensemble cast of characters. I'm going to go with The Heart is a Lonely Hunter by Carson McCullers, which is a beautiful book. Just the level of empathy that McCullers showcases in her writing, not just in The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, but her other books as well, is really inspiring and astonishing. And I'm not one for realism, but I feel like her characters are so vivid and so sad and beautiful and vulnerable that it's just a magnificent reading experience. It's also a book that I don't feel like is mentioned very often on BookTube either, even though I know it's got a high reputation. So certainly I recommend reading The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. It's a fantastic novel, and the rest of McCullers' work that I've read as well, even down to her short stories, is just extremely, extremely good and moving, and it makes you feel like a better person having read it, as kind of silly as that sounds. I could also say McCullers for this next one. The cook makes the food that feeds you. Tell us about a book that feeds your soul. Again, I think McCullers certainly does that, but I'm going to go with a book I just read last December, and that's the Bhagavad Gita, which got me thinking about spiritual things in a new way, and in a very positive way, I think. 23, The Yeoman Serves You. Tell us about a book that served its purpose, that did what you wanted it to. It wasn't great, but it wasn't bad. I'm going to go with a book I did a read-along with Steve Donahue of last October, and that's The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope, which was just a solid Victorian novel. I didn't think it was anything special, but I certainly wasn't bored reading it. In fact, I think that would also qualify for that earlier question of a book I can't imagine myself rereading. The idea of rereading The Way We Live Now fills me with dread, because I feel like I would be deeply bored reading it a second time. But I did enjoy it. It did, kind of what I expected, and it didn't do much more for me. 24, getting near the end here. Oh my, wow, this is certainly going to be the longest video I've ever made. The second nun talks about a saint's life in her tale. What book do you praise often? Of course, I know you guys are sick of hearing me talk about Crowley, but I'm going to go a little big. I made a video about this. This was my last video that I made before this one, and that will hopefully stand as a placeholder for any kind of future gushing about this book. I will try to refrain, but this is a book I praise often and will continue to praise. I'll try to shut up about it now for a while, though. And finally, The Nun's Priest is witty and doesn't take himself too seriously. Recommend a book that has a funny or witty main character. I am going to go with, oh my god, am I going to forget her name? It's Beatrice, right? From Much Ado About Nothing. I'm sorry, it's been, where is she? Yeah, Beatrice. I'm sorry. Beatrice from Much Ado About Nothing, who is a wonderful, witty character, again in the vein of much of Shakespeare, but I find her particularly charming for whatever reason. I have a bit of a crush on her as a character, and I think that she holds the play together, a play that is very, very perhaps shallow compared to many of Shakespeare's other plays. I think that's part of the point, though. I did make a video about this a few months ago for Shake Timber, which you may want to check out. But yeah, Beatrice is a fabulous, witty, charming character. And I deeply apologize to her for forgetting her name. And finally, I'm supposed to tag people, and I'm going to tag just a single person, because I feel like this has been making the rounds, and for all I know, he may have already been tagged. But I'm going to tag David Wiley. Because I think he is into medieval literature, and I'm sure he's a fan of the Canterbury Tales. So, David, if you're watching, feel free to do this. And anyone else who wants to do it, of course, consider yourself tagged. And, man, I am beat. That was rough, but a lot of fun. So, thank you for watching, and have a good day.